Lesson number 77 is about consecutive odd and even integers and fraction and decimal word problems. Our first problem says to find three consecutive even integers such that the sum of the first and the second equals the sum of the third and negative 10. So if we're looking at this, we need to know consecutive. Consecutive, that just means in a row. So if we have consecutive even integers, it must be even numbers that fall in a row or in order. So we could have like 2, 4, 6. Or maybe we had 8, 10, and 12. Now in this problem we know we have three consecutive even integers. We just need to find them. Now we need to find them such that the sum of the first and the second equals the sum of the third and negative 10. So what we notice between even integers is that we're always going to add 2 to get to the next one. 2 plus 2 is 4. 4 plus 2 is 6. 8 plus 2 is 10. 10 plus 2 is 12. So the way that we're going to write this out for our three consecutive integers, our first one will be called n. That's our first even integer. Our next one is n plus 2, because we always add 2 to the first one to get to our next even integer. And then we have n plus 4, because we're working with just the even numbers. Now here we have our first number, our first even integer, then we have our second, and we have our third even integer, because we needed to find three consecutive even integers. So this one says, such that the sum, that means add, of the first and the second. So if we're going to take the first and the second, we're going to say n, the first and the second, plus n plus 2 is going to equal the sum of the third and negative 10. Well, the third is n plus 4. And we're finding the sum of the third and negative 10, so we're going to subtract 10 from that. Now we can go ahead and add. We've got n plus n, that's 2n plus 2, is going to equal n, and we have 4 minus 10, that must be negative 6. Then we'll continue. Let's subtract n from both sides. We're going to be left with n plus 2 is equal to negative 6. We'll subtract 2 on both sides, so we're going to get n is going to equal, we're subtracting 2 on both sides, so negative 6 minus 2 more is going to equal negative 8. So here's our n. N is equal to negative 8. If n is equal to negative 8, then we have 3 in a row. We must get negative 8 first. Then our second number, that must be negative 6. And then we get negative 4. Because when we have consecutive even integers, they've got to be getting bigger as we go, because we're adding 2, and then we're adding 4 to it. Let's go ahead and look at our next problem. Find 4 consecutive odd integers such that the sum of the first and the fourth is 25 greater than the opposite of the third. So 4 consecutive odd integers. We might have 1, 3, 5, and 7. Now just because they're odd doesn't mean there's anything different. We always add 2 in order to get to the next number, just like we had with even numbers. So if we write that out, we're going to get an n for our first one. Our second one will be n plus 2. Then we have n plus 4. And finally n plus 6. So we've got our first number, second number, third number, and fourth number. Now we just need to write out our problem. So we have find 4 consecutive odd integers such that the sum, add, of the first and the fourth, so the first and the fourth, n and n plus 6, n plus n plus 6, is equal to 25 greater than the opposite of the third. So we want the opposite of the third, so we're going to say negative n plus 4, because we want the opposite of this whole thing, is 25 greater, so plus 25. And now we can go ahead and solve for this one. So as we go ahead and work through this problem, we're going to get 2n plus 6 will be equal to, and then we have a negative n minus 4, because we had to make everything in here the opposite, plus 25. And as we go ahead and solve, we get 2n plus 6 is equal to, we can simplify, negative 4 plus 25, that's going to give us positive 21. And now we'll go ahead and find our answer. We're going to add n to both sides, plus n. We add n to both sides, we end up with 3n plus 6 is equal to, and then we have, well, if we wanted to work through this, we're going to get n, negative n plus n, that cancels, so we get 21. Now, let's go ahead and subtract 6 from both sides, and we're going to get 3n is equal to 21 minus 6, that's 15. Well, we know 3 times 5 is 15, so n must be equal to 5. So if n is equal to 5, then we know 5 is our first number, then we must have 7, 9, and 11 as our answers. One thing we want to check, we want to make sure that we had odd integers. We do have odd integers, 5, 7, 9, and 11. Make sure you report all 4 in a row. Sometimes people just box the first answer and they got that right, but they needed to report everything else to show they understood the question. Let's move on to our next problem. Lopez used a 5-iron, but the ball covered only 4/5 of the required distance. If she hit the ball 112 yards, what was the required distance? So, in this problem, we need to use the keyword of, and that's going to help us to find the problem, or to find the answer to this problem, because we know 4/5 of the required distance. Okay? 4/5 of the required distance, of means multiply every single time. So 4/5 times the required distance, we'll call that RD. Okay? 4/5 of the required distance. Well, 4/5 of the required distance is how far she hit it. She hit it 112 yards. That's not quite as far as she needs to. So equal to 112. Now if we want to solve this, we'll make it 112 over 1, and then we'll work through the problem. We've got 4/5 times required distance equals 112 over 1. And in order to find out what our required distance is, we've got to undo multiplication of 4/5, and we're going to do that by multiplying by the reciprocal, because the 5's cancel and the 4's cancel. Now we need to balance everything out. We're going to multiply by 5 over 4, and then we can figure out what our answer is. Let's go ahead and simplify before we multiply. If we do that, we're going to get 112 over 1 times 5 over 4. And now let's cut both of our numbers in half. If we do that, half of 4 is 2. Half of 112 is going to give us 56. Half of 56, that's going to give us 28. Half of 2 is 1. So we can find our answer now. We can find our answer when we multiply 28 times 5. 28 times 5 gives us that final answer. Please pause the video now to work through that. Okay, 28 times 5. Let's see if you got it. 5 times 8 is 40. We carry the 4. 5 times 2 is 10, plus 4 more gives us 14. Well, when we look at that, 28 times 5 must be 140. So, what was the required distance? This is in yards, so it must have been 140 yards. And we have our final answer. Now, when we've got our answer, we need to make sure that it makes sense for this problem. So it says the ball covered only 4/5 of the required distance. So the required distance must have been further than 112 yards. 140 yards is definitely further than 112. So our answer makes sense. We've got this one. We can move on to the next question. Our lesson practice will be on page 318. Make sure you've got your notes complete, and I'll see you during our next class.